Section 51 of the Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Cynthia Moyer. Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 3, Section 51, The Napoleon of the People, from The Country Doctor, by Honoré de Balzac, Part 1. "Let us go to my barn," said the doctor, taking Genestus by the arm, after saying good night to the curate and his other guests. "And there, Captain Bluteau, you will hear about Napoleon. We shall find a few old cronies who will set Gogula, the postman, to declaiming about the people's God. Nicole, my stableman, was to put a ladder by which we can get into the hayloft through a window, and find a place where we can see and hear all that goes on. A valet is worth the trouble, believe me. Come, it isn't the first time I've hidden in the hay to hear the tale of a soldier or some peasant yarn. But we must hide. If these poor people see a stranger, they are constrained at once, and are no longer their natural selves." "Hey, my dear host," said Genestus, "haven't I often pretended to sleep, that I might listen to my troopers round a bivouac? I never laughed more heartily in the Paris theatres than I did at an account of the retreat from Moscow, told in fun by an old sergeant to a lot of recruits who were afraid of war. He declared the French army slept in sheets and drank its wine well iced; that the dead stood still in the roads. Russia was white, they curried the horses with their teeth. Those who liked to skate had lots of fun, and those who fancied frozen puddings ate their fill. The women were usually cold, and the only thing that was really disagreeable was the want of hot water to shave with. In short, he recounted such absurdities that an old quartermaster who had had his nose frozen off, and was known by the name Nez Restant, laughed himself. "Hush," said Benassis, "here we are. I'll go first. Follow me." The pair mounted the ladder and crouched in the hay, without being seen or heard by the people below, and placed themselves at ease, so that they could see and hear all that went on. The women were sitting in groups round the 3 or 4 candles that stood on the tables. Some were sewing, some knitting. Several sat idle, their necks stretched out and their heads and eyes turned to an old peasant who was telling a story. Most of the men were standing or lying on bales of hay. These groups, all perfectly silent, were scarcely visible in the flickering glimmer of the tallow candles, encircled by glass bowls full of water, which concentrated the light in rays upon the women at work about the tables. The size of the barn, whose roof was dark and sombre, still further obscured the rays of light, which touched the heads with unequal colour, and brought out picturesque effects of light and shade. Here the brown forehead and the clear eyes of an eager little peasant girl shone forth. There the rough brows of a few old men were sharply defined by a luminous band, which made fantastic shapes of their worn and discoloured garments. These various listeners, so diverse in their attitudes, all expressed on their motionless features the absolute abandonment of their intelligence to the narrator. It was a curious picture, illustrating the enormous influence exercised over every class of mind by poetry. In exacting from a storyteller the marvellous that must still be simple, or the impossible that is almost believable, the peasant proves himself to be a true lover of the purest poetry. "Come, Monsieur Gogula," said the gamekeeper, "tell us about the emperor." "The evening is half over," said the postman, "and I don't like to shorten the victories." "Never mind, go on. You've told them so many times, we know them all by heart, but it is always a pleasure to hear them again." "Yes, tell us about the emperor," cried many voices together. "Since you wish it," replied Gogula, "but you'll see it isn't worth much when I have to tell it on the double quick charge. I'd rather tell about a battle. Shall I tell about Champ Aubert, where we used up all the cartridges and spitted the enemy on our bayonets?" "No, no, the emperor, the emperor!" The veteran rose from his bale of hay, and cast upon the assemblage that black look laden with miseries, emergencies, and sufferings, which distinguishes the faces of old soldiers. He seized his jacket by the two front flaps, raised them as if about to pack the knapsack which formerly held his clothes, his shoes, and all his fortune. Then he threw the weight of his body on his left leg, advanced the right, and yielded with a good grace to the demands of the company. After pushing his gray hair to one side to show his forehead, he raised his head towards heaven that he might, as it were, put himself on the level of the gigantic history he was about to relate. "You see, my friends, Napoleon was born in Corsica, a French island warmed by the sun of Italy, where it is like a furnace, and where the people kill each other from father to son, all about nothing. That's a way they have. To begin with the marvel of the thing, his mother, who was the handsomest woman of her time, and a knowing one, bethought herself of dedicating him to God, so that he might escape the dangers of his childhood and future life. For she had dreamed that the world was set on fire the day he was born, and indeed it was a prophecy. So she asked God to protect him, on condition that Napoleon should restore his holy religion, which was then cast to the ground. Well, that was agreed upon, and we shall see what came of it. Follow me closely, and tell me if what you hear is in the nature of man. Sure and certain it is that none but a man who conceived the idea of making a compact with God could have passed unhurt through the enemy's lines, through cannon balls, and discharges of grape shot that swept the rest of us off like flies, and always respected his head. I had a proof of that, I myself, at Eylau. I see him now, as he rode up a height, took his field glass, looked at the battle, and said, "All goes well." One of those plumed busybodies, who plagued him considerably, and followed him everywhere, even to his meals, so they said, thought to play the wag, and took the emperor's place as he rode away. Ho! in a twinkling, head and plume were off. You must understand that Napoleon had promised to keep the secret of his compact all to himself. That's why all those who followed him, even his nearest friends, fell like nuts. Duroc, Bessieres, Lannes, all strong as steel bars, though he could bend them as he pleased. Besides, to prove he was the child of God, and made to be the father of soldiers, was he ever known to be lieutenant or captain? No, no, commander-in-chief from the start. He didn't look to be more than 24 years of age when he was an old general at the taking of Toulon, where he first began to show the others that they knew nothing about manoeuvring cannon. After that, down came our slip of a general to command the grand army of Italy, which hadn't bread, nor munitions, nor shoes, nor coats, a poor army, as naked as a worm. "My friends," said he, "here we are together. Get it into your pates that 15 days from now you will be conquerors. New clothes, good gaiters, famous shoes, and every man with a great coat. But, my children, to get these things you must march to Milan, where they are. and we marched. France, crushed as flat as a bedbug, straightened up. We were 30,000 bare feet against 80,000 Austrian bullies, all fine men, well set up. I see 'em now. But Napoleon, he was then only Bonaparte. He knew how to put the courage into us. We marched by night and we marched by day. We slapped their faces at Montenotte. We thrashed 'em at Rivoli, Lodi, Arcole, Millesimo, and we never let 'em up. A soldier gets the taste of conquest. So Napoleon whirled round those Austrian generals who didn't know where to poke themselves to get out of his way, and he pelted 'em well. Nipped off 10,000 men at a blow sometimes, by getting round them with 1,500 Frenchmen, and then he gleaned as he pleased. He took their cannon, their supplies, their money, their munitions, in short, all they had that was good to take. He fought them and beat them on the mountains. He drove them into the rivers and seas. He bit 'em in the air. He devoured 'em on the ground. And he lashed 'em everywhere. Hey, the grand army feathered itself well. For, d'ye see, the emperor, who was also a wit, called up the inhabitants and told them he was there to deliver them. So after that the natives lodged and cherished us. The women too, and very judicious they were. Now here's the end of it. In Ventose, '96, in those times that was the month of March of today, we lay cuddled in a corner of Savoy with the marmots, and yet before that campaign was over we were masters of Italy, just as Napoleon had predicted. And by the following March, in a single year and 2 campaigns, he had brought us within sight of Vienna. 'Twas a clean sweep. We devoured their armies one after the other, and made an end of 4 Austrian generals. One old fellow with white hair was roasted like a rat in the straw at Mantua. Kings begged for mercy on their knees. Peace was won. Could a man have done that? No, God helped him to a certainty. He divided himself up like the loaves in the gospel, commanded the battle by day, planned it by night, going and coming, for the sentinels saw him, never eating, never sleeping. So, seeing these prodigies, the soldiers adopted him for their father. Forward, march! Then those others, the rulers in Paris, seeing this, said to themselves, "Here's a bold one that seems to get his orders from the skies. He's likely to put his paw on France. We must let him loose on Asia. We will send him to America, perhaps that will satisfy him." But 'twas written above for him, as it was for Jesus Christ. The command went forth that he should go to Egypt. See again his resemblance to the Son of God. But that's not all. He called together his best veterans, his fire eaters, the ones he had particularly put the devil into, and he said to them like this: "My friends, they have given us Egypt to chew up, just to keep us busy, but we'll swallow it whole in a couple of campaigns, as we did Italy. The common soldiers shall be princes, and have the land for their own. Forward, march!" "Forward, march!" cried the sergeants, and there we were at Toulon, rowed to Egypt. At that time the English had all their ships in the sea, but when we embarked, Napoleon said, "They won't see us. It is just as well that you should know from this time forth that your general has got his star in the sky, which guides and protects us." What was said was done. Passing over the sea, we took Malta like an orange, just to quench his thirst for victory, for he was a man who couldn't live and do nothing. So here we are in Egypt. Good. Once here, other orders. The Egyptians, d'ye see, are men who, ever since the earth was, have had giants for sovereigns, and armies as numerous as ants. For, you must understand, that's the land of genii and crocodiles, where they've built pyramids as big as our mountains, and buried their kings under them to keep them fresh, an idea that pleased them mightily. So then, after we disembarked, the little corporal said to us, "My children, the country you are going to conquer has a lot of gods that you must respect, because Frenchmen ought to be friends with everybody, and fight the nations without vexing the inhabitants. Get it into your skulls that you are not to touch anything at first, for it is all going to be yours soon. Forward, march!" So far, so good. But all those people of Africa, to whom Napoleon was foretold under the name of Kebir Bonaberdis, a word of their lingo that means the Sultan fires, were afraid as the devil of him. So the Grand Turk and Asia and Africa had recourse to magic. They sent us a demon named the Mahdi, supposed to have descended from heaven on a white horse, which, like its master, was bullet-proof. And both of them lived on air, without food to support them. There are some that say they saw them, but I can't give you any reasons to make you certain about that. The rulers of Arabia and the Mamelukes tried to make their troopers believe that the Mahdi could keep them from perishing in battle, and they pretended he was an angel sent from heaven to fight Napoleon and get back Solomon's seal. Solomon's seal was part of their paraphernalia, which they vowed our general had stolen. You must understand that we'd given 'em a good many wry faces, in spite of what he had said to us. Now, tell me how they knew that Napoleon had a pact with God. Was that natural, d'ye think? They held to it in their minds that Napoleon commanded the genii, and could pass hither and thither in the twinkling of an eye like a bird. The fact is, he was everywhere. At last it came to his carrying off a queen, beautiful as the dawn, for whom he had offered all his treasure, and diamonds as big as pigeons' eggs, a bargain which the Mameluke to whom she particularly belonged positively refused, although he had several others. Such matters, when they come to that pass, can't be settled without a great many battles. And, indeed, there was no scarcity of battles. There was fighting enough to please everybody. We were in line at Alexandria, at Gizeh, and before the pyramids. We marched in the sun and through the sand, where some who had the dazzles saw water that they couldn't drink, and shade where their flesh was roasted. But we made short work of the Mamelukes, and everybody else yielded at the voice of Napoleon, who took possession of Upper and Lower Egypt, Arabia, and even the capitals of kingdoms that were no more, where there were thousands of statues and all the plagues of Egypt, more particularly lizards, a mammoth of a country where everybody could take his acres of land for as little as he pleased. Well, while Napoleon was busy with his affairs inland, where he had it in his head to do fine things, the English burned his fleet at Aboukir, for they were always looking about them to annoy us. But Napoleon, who had the respect of the East and of the West, whom the Pope called his son, and the cousin of Mohammed called his dear father, resolved to punish England, and get hold of India in exchange for his fleet. He was just about to take us across the Red Sea into Asia, a country where there are diamonds and gold to pay the soldiers, and palaces for bivouacs, when the Mahdi made a treaty with the plague, and sent it down to hinder our victories. Halt! The army to a man defiled at that parade, and few there were who came back on their feet. Dying soldiers couldn't take Saint Jean d'Arc. though they rushed at it 3 times with generous and martial obstinacy. The plague was the strongest. No saying to that enemy, my good friend. Every soldier lay ill. Napoleon alone was fresh as a rose, and the whole army saw him drinking in pestilence without its doing him a bit of harm. Ha, my friends, will you tell me that that's in the nature of a mere man? The Mamelukes, knowing we were all in the ambulances, thought they could stop the way, but that sort of joke wouldn't do with Napoleon. So he said to his demons, his veterans, those that had the toughest hide, "Go, clear me the way." Junot, a sabre of the first cut and his particular friend, took 1,000 men, no more, and ripped up the army of the Pasha who had had the presumption to put himself in the way. After that we came back to headquarters at Cairo. Now, here's another side of the story. Napoleon absent, France was letting herself be ruined by the rulers in Paris, who kept back the pay of the soldiers of the other armies, and their clothing, and their rations, left them to die of hunger, and expected them to lay down the law to the universe without taking any trouble to help them. Idiots, who amused themselves by chattering instead of putting their own hands in the dough. Well, that's how it happened that our armies were beaten, and the frontiers of France were encroached upon. The man was not there. Now observe, I say man, because that's what they called him, but 'twas nonsense, for he had a star and all its belongings. It was we who were only men. He taught history to France after his famous battle of Aboukir, where, without losing more than 300 men, and with a single division, he vanquished the grand army of the Turk, 75,000 strong, and hustled more than half of it into the sea. Rah! That was his last thunderclap in Egypt. He said to himself, seeing the way things were going in Paris, "I am the savior of France. I know it, and I must go." But understand me, the army didn't know he was going, or they'd have kept him by force and made him Emperor of the East. So now we were sad, for he was gone who was all our joy. He left the command to Kleber, a big mastiff who came off duty at Cairo assassinated by an Egyptian, whom they put to death by impaling him on a bayonet. That's the way they guillotine people down there. But it makes them suffer so much that a soldier had pity on the criminal and gave him his canteen, and then, as soon as the Egyptian had drunk his fill, he gave up the ghost with all the pleasure in life. But that's a trifle we couldn't laugh at then. Napoleon embarked in a cockle-shell, a little skiff that was nothing at all, though 'twas called Fortune, and in a twinkling, under the nose of England, who was blockading him with ships of the line, frigates, and anything that could hoist a sail, he crossed over, and there he was in France. For he always had the power, mind you, of crossing the seas at one straddle. Was that a human man? Bah! So 1 minute he is at Fréjus, the next in Paris. There they all adore him, but he summons the government. "What have you done with my children, the soldiers?" he says to the lawyers. "You're a mob of rascally scribblers. You are making France a mess of pottage, and snapping your fingers at what people think of you. It won't do, and I speak the opinion of everybody." So, on that, they wanted to battle with him and kill him. Click, he had 'em locked up in barracks, or flying out of windows, or drafted among his followers, where they were as mute as fishes, and as pliable as a quid of tobacco. After that stroke, Consul! And then, as it was not for him to doubt the Supreme Being, he fulfilled his promise to the good God, who, you see, had kept his word to him. He gave him back his churches and re-established his religion. the bells rang for God and for him, and lo, everybody was pleased. Primo, the priests, whom he saved from being harassed. Secundo, the bourgeois, who thought only of their trade, and no longer had to fear the rapiamus of the law, which had got to be unjust. Tertio, the nobles, for he forbade they should be killed, as, unfortunately, the people had got the habit of doing. But he still had the enemy to wipe out. And he wasn't the man to go to sleep at a mess table, because, d'ye see, his eye looked over the whole earth, as if it were no bigger than a man's head. So then he appeared in Italy, like as though he had stuck his head through the window. One glance was enough. The Austrians were swallowed up at Marengo, like so many gudgeons by a whale. Oof! The French eagles sang their paeans so loud that all the world heard them, and it sufficed. "We won't play that game any more," said the German. "Enough, enough," said all the rest. To sum up, Europe backed down, England knocked under. General peace, and the kings and the people made believe kiss each other. That's the time when the emperor invented the Legion of Honor, and a fine thing too. In France, this is what he said at Boulogne before the whole army: "Every man is brave, so the citizen who does a fine action shall be sister to the soldier, and the soldier shall be his brother, and the two shall be one under the flag of honor." We who were down in Egypt now came home. All was changed. He left us general, and hey, in a twinkling we found him emperor. France gave herself to him, like a fine girl to a lancer. When it was done, to the satisfaction of all, as you may say, a sacred ceremony took place, the like of which was never seen under the canopy of the skies. The Pope and the cardinals, in their red and gold vestments, crossed the Alps expressly to crown him before the army and the people, who clapped their hands. There is one thing that I should do very wrong not to tell you. In Egypt, in the desert close to Syria, the red man came to him on the Mount of Moses and said, "All is well." Then, at Marengo, the night before the victory, the same red man appeared before him for the second time, standing erect and saying, "Thou shalt see the world at thy feet. Thou shalt be Emperor of France, King of Italy, Master of Holland, Sovereign of Spain, Portugal, and the Illyrian provinces, Protector of Germany, Saviour of Poland, First Eagle of the Legion of Honor, all." This red man, you understand, was his genius, his spirit, a sort of satellite who served him, as some say, to communicate with his star. I never really believed that. But the red man himself is a true fact. Napoleon spoke of him, and said he came to him in troubled moments, and lived in the palace of the Tuileries under the roof. So, on the day of the coronation, Napoleon saw him for the third time, and they were in consultation over many things. After that, Napoleon went to Milan to be crowned King of Italy, and there the grand triumph of the soldier began. Every man who could write was made an officer. Down came pensions. It rained ducats. Treasures poured in for the staff which didn't cost France a penny, and the Legion of Honor provided incomes for the private soldiers, of which I receive mine to this day. So here were the armies maintained as never before on this earth. But besides that, the emperor, knowing that he was to be the emperor of the whole world, bethought him of the bourgeois, and to please them he built fairy monuments, after their own ideas, in places where you'd never think to find any. For instance, suppose you were coming back from Spain, and going to Berlin. Well, you'd find triumphal arches along the way, with common soldiers sculptured on the stone, every bit the same as generals. In 2 or 3 years, and without imposing taxes on any of you, Napoleon filled his vaults with gold, built palaces, made bridges, roads, scholars, fetes, laws, vessels, harbours, and spent millions upon millions, such enormous sums that he could, so they tell me, have paved France from end to end with 5-franc pieces if he had had a mind to. Now, when he sat at ease on his throne, and was master of all, so that Europe waited his permission to do his bidding, he remembered his 4 brothers and his 3 sisters, and he said to us, as it might be in conversation, in an order of the day, "My children, is it right that the blood relations of your emperor should be begging their bread? No, I wish to see them in splendour like myself. It becomes, therefore, absolutely necessary to conquer a kingdom for each of them, to the end that Frenchmen may be masters over all lands, that the soldiers of the guard shall make the whole earth tremble, that France may spit where she likes, and that all the nations shall say to her, as it is written on my copper coins, 'God protects you.'" "Agreed," cried the army. "We'll go fish for thy kingdoms with our bayonets. Ha! there was no backing down, don't you see? If he had taken it into his head to conquer the moon, we should have made ready, packed knapsacks, and clambered up. Happily he didn't think of it. The kings of the countries, who liked their comfortable thrones, were naturally loath to budge, and had to have their ears pulled. So then, forward march! We did march, we got there, and the earth once more trembled to its centre. Hey, the men and the shoes he used up in those days! The enemy dealt us such blows that none but the grand army could have stood the fatigue of it. But you are not ignorant that a Frenchman is born a philosopher, and knows that a little sooner or a little later he has got to die. So we were ready to die without a word, for we liked to see the emperor doing that on the geographies. Section 51.